The question I keep returning to is not why the monsters were put there, it is why they were put there so consistently, across so many maps, drawn by so many different hands, in so many different centuries, all clustering in the same region of the world, the far south where Antarctica now sits. That consistency is the thing that does not leave me alone. A single cartographer populating the southern seas with sea creatures makes complete sense. Cartographers ornamented uncertainty. That was a recognized professional practice. But when you lay the major maps of the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries side by side, the distribution stops feeling merely decorative. It begins to feel deliberate, not in the dramatic sense, not in the way revelations tend to announce themselves, deliberate in a quieter, more structural sense, as if a shared understanding existed among these map makers about what that region meant and why a person should not go there. That distinction matters enormously to me. So I want to think through this carefully and honestly, which includes holding the counter-arguments in view the entire time. Because the real question underneath all of this is not about monsters. It is about what cartographers knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge when they put pen to vellum. The accepted historical explanation for sea monsters on maps is simple and genuinely elegant. Medieval and Renaissance cartographers operated under a principle sometimes described as horror vacui, a discomfort with empty space. A blank region on a map felt like an admission of professional failure. Sea creatures were a recognized visual convention for representing uncertainty and the limits of knowledge, and that explanation holds up across a remarkable range of the evidence. Aulus Magnus's Carta Marina, published in 1539, populates the northern seas with serpents of extraordinary specificity, coiled, many-headed creatures that the scholar Chet van Duzer has documented as drawing heavily from classical literary tradition rather than any observed animal. They are borrowed imagery operating within a professional idiom, not reported sightings. So when historians look at the monsters clustered around the southern edges of the world maps, circling the region we now call the Southern Ocean, they say same tradition, same decorative convention filling spaces where no reliable information existed. The southern seas were uncharted, so they were ornamented with the standard imagery of the unknown. This is a coherent account. I want to be clear that I am not dismissing it. This explanation accounts for a great deal of what we see, and it is the responsible default position. What I am asking is a narrower question. Why would a decorative convention apply so specifically, so persistently, and so densely to one region, rather than spreading more evenly across the many blank areas these maps contained? Here is what first stopped me. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis completed a world map that, in its southern regions, shows a landmass extending below the known continents. Mainstream scholars identify this as a distorted rendering of South America's southern coast, possibly compressed against a theoretical terra australis. That is the considered consensus position, based on careful analysis. But in the 1950s, an American engineer and amateur cartographer named Arlington Mallory examined the Piri Reis Map and made a claim that has not been cleanly resolved, that the southern landmass shown does not correspond to South America's distorted coast, but to Antarctica's, specifically to the sub-glacial coastline lying beneath the modern ice sheet. That claim entered a serious academic discussion and never fully left it. In 1961, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, of the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base, wrote to Charles Hapgood, the geography professor then studying the question, stating that certain features of the Piri Reis Map's southern regions appeared consistent with geographical characteristics of Antarctica. That letter exists. It is part of the documented correspondence Hapgood published. It has not been fabricated. Now I want to pause and hold the counter-argument clearly because it is a serious one. The projection Piri Reis used was non-standard, and distortions accumulated when copying from multiple Portolan sources could explain much of the apparent correspondence with Antarctic geography. The coastline might simply be a compressed, distorted South America attached to a speculative continent. Mainstream scholars who make this argument are not being careless. But here is what I cannot set aside. Piri Reis wrote margin notes on his own map explaining his sources. He described drawing from ancient charts, Greek and Arabic originals he had collected to compile his work. He was not presenting himself as a discoverer of the South. He was presenting himself as a compiler. And that framing raises a question the distortion argument does not fully answer. What was in those source charts? Because then you encounter the Oronteus Finaeus Map of 1531, and the problem deepens. Finaeus, Oronce Fine, a French mathematician and royal lecturer in Paris, drew a southern continent with a specificity difficult to attribute to pure imagination. Not a vague blob, but a landmass with mountain ranges, what appear to be river systems, and coastal indentations drawn with the confidence of an instrument record rather than theoretical speculation. The detail that matters is this: those coastal features, the inlet positions, the rough placement of mountain ranges, the approximate shape of the landmass as a whole, correspond with notable accuracy to what seismic and radar surveys conducted in the 20th century revealed about Antarctica's sub-glacial geography. The continent beneath the ice is not a smooth dome. It has mountains, valleys, and a specific shape that echoes, in rough outline, what Finaeus drew 5 centuries ago. Charles Hapgood analysed this correspondence in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and I know what you are thinking. Hapgood is a controversial figure. His theory of Earth crust displacement is not accepted by mainstream geology, and it probably should not be. But his map analysis is a separate argument from his geological theory, and conflating the two is a way of avoiding the map question rather than answering it. Then there is the Philippe Buache Map of 1737. Buache was a French geographer of considerable institutional standing, appointed Premier Géographe du Roi, who drew a southern continent divided into 2 landmasses separated by a central sea. He had no expedition data from that region, no European had charted it, and yet subglacial surveys conducted during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 58 showed exactly this. Beneath the ice, Antarctica is not one undivided landmass, but 2 major geological units separated by a subglacial basin. I want to be fair to the counter-argument here, because it is the honest thing to do. Buache's divided continent was largely theoretical. He believed a southern landmass was necessary to balance global land distribution, and his division may have followed from reasoning about geographic symmetry rather than any access to ancient sources. Arriving at the right general shape by following the wrong logic is entirely possible. I cannot rule that out. But here is where the pattern becomes something more than a series of individual coincidences. You have Piri Reis in 1513, citing ancient sources he named, but which cannot be verified, drawing a southern landmass that raises unresolved questions. You have Finaeus in 1531, adding geographic detail no European expedition had reached. You have Buache in 1737, dividing a continent he had no instruments to measure. Each is individually explainable. Together they form something harder to dismiss individually, and running through all three, running through nearly every major cartographic treatment of the southern regions from the 15th century through the 17th, is the concentration of monsters, not scattered, not uniform across the blank spaces of the world, concentrated specifically at the approaches to the southern landmass, along the routes that would have led a navigator toward it. That clustering does not appear in the same density anywhere else on these maps. Gerard Mercator's 1569 world map, the one whose projection still shapes how we visualize the globe today, included a detailed terra australis in the south, with coastline features that suggested familiarity rather than pure speculation. And at the northern approach to that continent, Mercator placed his monsters, not scattered across the Southern Ocean, at the threshold, at the entry point, as if marking a perimeter rather than decorating an absence. Abraham Ortelius, Mercator's contemporary and the creator of the first modern world atlas in 1570, did functionally the same thing. His Terra Australis is present, detailed, and surrounded by sea creatures placed at the boundary between the navigable world and whatever lay beyond it. Ortelius and Mercator were commercial competitors. They worked from different source materials and different patron relationships. Their monster placement is nevertheless structurally identical. This is the part where I want to ask you to sit with a thought that I do not find exciting. I want to be clear about that. I find it uncomfortable. If the monster placement was purely decorative, purely a matter of filling empty space with inherited visual convention, why is the clustering so geographically specific? Empty space existed across these maps in abundance. Monsters did not fill it uniformly. They gathered in the south. The North Atlantic carried monsters in some maps. The Indian Ocean had its creatures, but no region attracted the sustained, multi-generational, multicultural concentration of monstrous imagery that the southern approaches consistently received, and no other region where monsters clustered happened to correspond to a landmass that, according to the accepted historical timeline, had not yet been discovered and would not be until 1820. Antarctica was officially sighted for the first time in 1820. Fabian von Bellingshausen of the Russian Imperial Navy and Edward Bransfield of the Royal Navy made independent sightings within days of each other in January of that year. Nathaniel Palmer of the American Sealing Fleet followed later that same year, entirely independently. 3 expeditions, no coordination, the same conclusion within months. The maps already describing its approximate shape predate that moment by nearly 300 years. Now I want to make an argument that gets consistently overlooked in discussions of this subject. The easy version of this story says that someone suppressed knowledge of Antarctica, some institution, some coordinated power, a deliberate cover-up spanning centuries. I do not find that version credible, and I want to say clearly why. Deliberate conspiracies require active coordination, and sustained coordination across competing and often hostile imperial powers is not how institutions actually behave over centuries. What I think happened is something subtler and, in some ways, more structurally interesting. The cartographers who placed monsters at the southern threshold were not coordinating with each other. They were drawing from the same inherited body of source material and operating within the same institutional context, the context of maritime empires with significant strategic interests in controlling navigational knowledge. The silence, if there was one, organized itself through shared incentive rather than shared instruction. Consider the institutional framework. The major cartographic traditions of the 15th through 17th centuries were embedded in maritime empires with enormous commercial and military stakes in geographic knowledge. Maps were not freely circulated public documents, they were strategic assets. Spain maintained the Casa de Contratación in Seville specifically to regulate and classify geographic information, treating cartographic data as a form of state intelligence for over 2 centuries. Portugal maintained the equivalent Casa de India. The Ottoman Empire, under whose patronage Piri Reis worked as a naval commander, treated cartographic intelligence as an arm of naval infrastructure. These were institutions that understood precisely the value of knowing what rivals did not know, and of ensuring strategically significant knowledge did not circulate freely. This is not conspiracy. It is documented standard practice across every major empire of the period. Now I want to speculate, and I want to name it clearly as speculation. Suppose that some fragment of geographical knowledge about the far south existed in the accumulated source material these cartographers inherited. Not complete knowledge, not a detailed survey, but a rough outline, enough to know that something was there. The strategic question facing any imperial cartographer who encountered that fragment would be immediate. Do you publish this openly, or do you mark it? The monsters would be the most operationally elegant solution available. You do not suppress geographical knowledge by erasing it. Erasure leaves traces and invites questions. You manage it by surrounding it with the one symbol that every trained navigator of the period understood without any further explanation. This is a region you are not meant to enter. Sea monsters on a professional map were not merely decorative, they were operational navigational signals in an era when cosmography and sailing practice were not yet separated disciplines. And here is the structurally important part. Once that convention was established by the earliest maps in the tradition, it would replicate itself without any need for ongoing coordination. Every subsequent cartographer copying from prior sources would copy the monsters along with the coastlines, the rivers, the mountain ranges. The signal would propagate through the tradition under its own inertia, generation after generation, without anyone issuing new instructions. Institutional momentum is the most durable form of information management ever devised. Let me name the strongest counter-argument now, because it deserves to be named directly. The simplest explanation for everything I have laid out is this. Ancient cartographers theorized a southern continent as Aristotle had, as Strabo had, and drew detailed, speculative versions of it based on geographic symmetry. The monsters appeared there because it was the edge of the known world, not because any specific knowledge was being marked or protected. Tradition plus speculation equals the entire pattern. That explanation accounts for most of what I have described here. I mean that genuinely. If you accept that the Finaeus correspondence with sub-glacial Antarctic geography is the product of lucky speculation rather than encoded knowledge, much of the framework I am building becomes significantly less stable. The counter-argument is not a weak one. It is the responsible default, and it is where most careful historians reasonably stop. But it does not fully account for the specificity of Buache division. It does not fully account for Piri Reis's margin notes naming ancient sources for a region no documented European expedition had reached. it does not account for the repeated pattern in which subglacial surveys of the mid to late 20th century keep producing results that echo, in rough outline, maps drawn before those surveys were conceivable. Each instance has an individual explanation. Their accumulation is harder, and there is one more thing the tradition argument does not account for. Antarctica was not just unknown to Europeans before 1820. It was practically inaccessible. The pack ice of the Southern Ocean forms a barrier that made sustained southern exploration genuinely impossible before modern icebreaker technology. Whatever geographical knowledge fragments may have existed in the source material Piri Reis and others drew from would have had to originate from a time when that coastline was accessible, which raises its own uncomfortable set of questions about timing. The mainstream geological position is that Antarctica has been substantially glaciated for approximately 34 million years, with ice coverage sufficient to obscure the coastal geography we are discussing. If that timeline is correct, and I have no strong reason to doubt it, then no human civilization operating within any historical period we recognize could have surveyed the southern coastline in any meaningful form. That is a real boundary, I do not diminish it, but the West Antarctic ice sheet is now understood to have experienced significant instability during the last interglacial period, roughly 115,000 to 130,000 years ago. That is not recent in any human sense, and yet it is a reminder that the Antarctic ice has a more complicated history than a single stable narrative suggests. The boundary is real. Its edges are not quite as fixed as they once appeared. So where does this leave us, honestly? It leaves us between two positions, neither of which sits entirely comfortably. The first is that the correspondence between ancient maps and subglacial Antarctic geography is the product of coincidence layered on speculation, and the monsters are standard professional decoration. That position is defensible. It is the more economical explanation by most measures. I cannot disprove it. The second position is that something existed, some fragment of geographical knowledge, some inheritance from a source tradition older than our documented record, that filtered through the cartographic tradition in two simultaneous forms, a suspicious degree of geographic specificity and a consistent pattern of monstrous warning placed at the region's threshold. That position is not provable, but it is also not as easily dismissed as its critics tend to imply. What I keep returning to is the nature of the monsters themselves, not as evidence of anything beyond professional cartographic convention. They were never that, not even to the men who drew them, but as a signal type, as a specific professional choice. Every part of the known world received some ornamentation in this period, yes, but no other region received this concentration of threshold imagery on top of maps that contained geographical data their makers had no obvious way to possess. The monsters sit at the edge of something. They always have. And the question I have been circling, the one that is actually uncomfortable, not in an exciting way, but in a quiet and persistent way, is not whether ancient cartographers had knowledge of Antarctica. That question has reasonable answers available. The question is what they thought they were protecting. Because what you mark with monsters is never nothing. You mark with monsters what you need to keep people away from. The history of cartography is full of deliberate omissions, blank spaces, vague coastlines, intentional imprecision used to protect commercial routes from rival powers. The Portuguese deliberately obscured their early charts of the African coast to prevent Spanish navigation of the same routes. Institutional suppression of geographic knowledge was routine. What was less routine was marking the suppression signalling it openly while managing its content. That is what the monsters around the far south appear to do. They do not erase the region. They point to it. They sit at its threshold and say, "Here is the place." In the most precise cartographic reading, a marker implies something being marked. And this particular marker appeared in map after map, across empires that otherwise agreed on almost nothing, through a tradition that sustained itself for more than 2 centuries without any documented channel of coordination between its contributors. I cannot tell you what was being marked. I want to say that plainly, because intellectual honesty demands it. I cannot tell you whether the knowledge encoded in these maps, if any knowledge was encoded at all, came from ancient Greek theoretical geography, from a lost tradition of early maritime exploration, from source charts of genuinely unknown origin, or from something else that we do not yet have adequate language to describe. What I can tell you is that when the sub-glacial surveys of the mid-20th century and the decades that followed built a clearer picture of the continent beneath the ice, the shape that emerged was not randomly divergent from the shapes that Finaeus and Buache had drawn. It was approximately consistent with them. Not identically, the correspondence is not perfect, and I would not claim it is, but approximately consistent across a gap of 5 centuries in cartography. That distance is not comfortable. I am not asking you to believe that an ancient civilization surveyed Antarctica and left its maps in an archive that Piri Reis compiled from. I am asking you to sit with the question of how these maps got as close as they did, and to sit with it without rushing toward the most available resolution. The resolution exists, you can take it, but underneath it, the question will remain if you let yourself notice it. The cartographers who drew these maps were careful, technically skilled professionals who understood exactly what every symbol on their work communicated. The difference between decoration and warning was not subtle to them. It was fundamental to the function of the artifact they were producing. Monsters placed at a random threshold are one thing. Monsters placed consistently at the same threshold by independent hands across centuries are something that requires a different kind of explanation. Whatever they were standing in front of remains under ice, unchanged, unreachable, and patient in the way that very large things are patient. The ice does not rush. The question does not resolve. Both of them have been waiting in their separate registers for the same thing. Someone willing to cross the line the monsters were placed to mark, with better instruments than the ones available to the men who drew them. I keep looking at those maps and thinking, this was not decoration. I keep looking at the sub-glacial surveys and thinking, this is not coincidence. I keep looking at the silence between those two thoughts. That specific, narrow silence where the conventional explanation and the evidence fail to fully meet, and thinking that there is something in there, something the ice has kept, and the maps have hinted at, and no one has yet been willing to name, not because the evidence is absent, but because of what the naming would cost.